Welcome, everybody. My name is Rob Lee. I'm the CEO and co-founder over at Dragos, and Ben Miller on with us, who's the VP of Services and R&D at Dragos. And what we wanted to talk about today in this audience was looking at SolarWinds, but there was some interesting lessons learned and some takeaways, as well as how SolarWinds is deployed in our environment. We just wanted to take 25, 30 minutes to quickly run through that. Ben, if you could, next slide, please. And just to kick off with, like I said, what we're going to talk about, to understand the incident response cases in SolarWinds, which we think were pretty underexplored. It was a lot of topics, a lot of talks, a lot of testimony publicly on what was happening in the enterprise IT networks, and there was some really good work done by Microsoft and FireEye and CrowdStrike on that work. And we're not going to recap it, just point you to their research. They did a phenomenal job with how they handled it. On the OT side, though, and the ICS, the industrial equipment, not a whole lot discussed, and I don't think there was a whole lot of public discussion on the incidents that took place there. So that's really what this talk is focused on. But to kick off with that, we'll have to describe kind of why is SolarWinds and ICS networks anyways, and how is it used, and where would you find it? And hopefully for all of those of you that have industrial networks, you can be thinking about this in terms of what you do the next time. Ben will get into some of the insights for incident response, and then I want to cover why are we here in the first place? Why is this such a challenge in OT? And hopefully that'll leave you with some recommendations and things to think about. Next slide. All right. So as we look at SolarWinds and ICS, which go to the next slide, the first thing to be aware of is how these networks have SolarWinds and where they usually manifest. Now, in a perfect world, SolarWinds was getting used for network performance management, and it was getting used in a way that you were deployed in like a DMZ and then reaching in for the communications that you needed, probably at the L3 or kind of supervisory level, not going down to L1 and L2. In reality, even in well-architected networks, they were reaching into L1 and L2, having direct interactions with things like program logic controllers and RTUs. And they were being used not only for performance monitoring, but in some cases actually had write privileges and being able to access and really restart systems and restart services when there were issues across the industrial control network. So in our experience with SolarWinds, pretty widely used in operations networks. And the key takeaway here is even when they were well architected, you would find that SolarWinds had a crazy amount of access in those environments, where compromising SolarWinds would give you direct access and control over control elements in that industrial environment. It's not like, hey, we're segmented and we properly architect this. Regardless, by its implementation and use, you had access to the control elements themselves, which meant that you could manipulate or cause impacts when you start talking about the physical process. Next slide. Now, one thing that caught a lot of people off guard, and this is kind of from our cases, customers kind of fell into three buckets. The first bucket was, we don't have SolarWinds, it's not in our inventory, we didn't buy it, we don't have it. Second bucket was same, we don't have it, but they had a security stack from a vendor that was like and it is not saying this vendor specifically, but like a GE security stack or so forth. Like it's our security, white labeled kind of stack. And the third bucket was, we've got connections, but we're really segmented from other networks, and I don't even know that anybody would have access. And in all three buckets, we found people that had compromised SolarWinds. In the first bucket of people that had it directly, it was actually getting bought and purchased by the plant personnel, generation staff, or folks outside of corporate IT and corporate purchasing, and it was being used in those cases that we discussed for monitoring and performance management across operations networks. In the second bucket, we would find original equipment manufacturers like the big ICS vendors in their security stacks. They're really just white labeling commercial products. So it would say the vendor's name on the front, but behind the scenes, it was actually something like SolarWinds. And SolarWinds showed up in a bunch of cases in that way. The third one, which is described here on the screen, is probably the most important one. And that's where SolarWinds was not in the environment, not white labeled and not actually in the environment directly. However, it was in the vendor and integrators networks, and they were using it in the industrial networks for maintenance purposes. And you will normally find that no matter how much your folks argue with you that we're segmented, we're not connected to anybody, like we don't touch the internet, you'll find that they have these maintenance links and diagnostics links and VPN access to their original equipment manufacturers and integrators and service and maintenance personnel. And so they're actually very connected. These environments are much more connected than people realize. And across those maintenance links, that's where the vendors and integrators were leveraging SolarWinds on their side of the house across those network links into your industrial networks. So if they're compromised, it's the straight access into those operations networks anyways, usually with SolarWinds already configured to be part of that. The interesting thing here is we saw two global OEMs that were compromised with the compromised version of SolarWinds that had access to hundreds of sites around the world. And these sites were accessing everything from turbine control software to very, very sensitive applications that were happening down in those networks. Now, we're not saying that there was second stage activity, that the adversary followed up and did anything malicious, but it's not a vulnerable version of SolarWinds. It's a compromised version of SolarWinds. So they were compromised and the adversary had access. Whether or not they chose to do anything with that was on the intent of the adversary, not a discussion of their capability. Their capability was far more than people realized because of these type of network drawings. Next slide. And so when we think about it from a threat perspective, and then Ben will kick into kind of the incident response lessons learned, a couple case studies we had. When we have a takeaway from SolarWinds, first and foremost, ICS environments were compromised. I know this is potentially semantics, but I see a lot of people talking about, well, we didn't have the vulnerable version of SolarWinds. There was not a vulnerable version of SolarWinds. It was a compromised version of SolarWinds. SolarWinds being embedded in the build process. So a lot of these sites were compromised, and we responded to a number of companies where they were compromised with that version of SolarWinds. And Ben will talk through our lessons learned and kind of what was the challenge. And there were quite a bit of challenges in terms of being resilient against something like this. But when you look at the sort of the theme here, SolarWinds may be one type of IT application you're using, but a lot of that stuff is already in OT. And so when I try to describe OT to folks, whether you're talking ICS or OT, it really just depends on your audience. But when I try to describe that to folks, I tell them OT is everything we have in IT plus physics. So it's not like you're not going to find certain IT applications in your operations environments. You will, but you also find purpose-built systems and purpose-built equipment and a physical process and things that shouldn't be treated like IT, no matter what the Microsoft Windows banner tells you. It's an OT piece of equipment, it needs to be treated as such. What we historically see with adversaries targeting industrial, and to date we track 15 different state actors that explicitly target industrial environments. What we see is there are a couple threats that have shown the capability and the intent to do disruptive attacks. The Electrum team from the 2016 Ukraine attack, like a Conosite and maybe Sandworm kind of links over in 2015 Ukraine attack. You see Xenotime compromising safety systems and trying to kill people in a petrochemical environment in Saudi Arabia. Sure, there's a couple of those that have gone the distance. There's a larger group that haven't reached that yet, that maybe have access to industrial environments and they're learning, but we haven't seen the intent and we haven't seen an ICS specific capability, but they're on that journey and we don't want them to get there. And then there's even a larger group of state actors that are targeting enterprise IT networks to get access to ICS and to start learning the industrial environments, but are definitely earlier in their journey. And what we can tell from the limited data we have is it's usually a multi-year journey to progress down that line. So when we see a lot more groups on the top of the funnel, it tells us that there's this trend of groups moving along to further develop their intent and capabilities on industrial. We need to get ahead of it. And when we think about the supply chain, we are very, very dependent in the industrial community on all sorts of different governments and foreign countries. And we consistently see the adversaries taking advantage of that, not just in SolarWinds build processes, but targeting the industrial equipment manufacturers and integrators directly. Xenotime, as an example, compromised multiple original equipment manufacturers after they targeted a safety system in Saudi Arabia. So we see this coming up and up again. So the theme of today and kind of lessons learned or not, how do you respond to SolarWinds? It's what did we learn from responding to SolarWinds and what should you take forward as you look at other supply chain issues? A lot of folks will want to look at chipsets and backdoors and hardware. And the reality is the biggest supply chain concerns are the interconnections and the trust that we have between vendors and suppliers, not chips and rice grain chips on boards. Next slide. And then the last thing I'll note, which I think is more for a policy audience. So for those of you that are from policy circles, this was something I was privately briefing back staffers and similar earlier this year and late last year. A lot of the conversation, again, was dominated on enterprise. And I think some firms came out and made some very professional and good assessments that the espionage or the intrusions that was taking place in the enterprise was very espionage focused. Maybe even some links to SVRs. People started making that kind of link. Not our analysis. We're not commenting one way or the other. But making connections to saying, hey, this is intelligence operations. This group historically does espionage. It's nothing attack based. And that's totally fair on the enterprise side. On the operations side, though, there's differences in terms of how you target those environments and what you do it for. And sometimes getting access is the hardest thing. So just because an adversary has access doesn't mean they're going to immediately use that access. And so we usually talk about access operations versus effects operations. Access operations are that let's get access and then hold on to it. And we saw a lot of that in the pandemic in general as remote access became a really accessible thing for adversaries. That was a generational event for a lot of your intelligence agencies around the world, or unique opportunity. So in the same way we think about access operations, we think about, well, what can you do with that? What would the effects operation be? And they're generally not one and the same. So an intelligence agency in Russia, if that's who compromised these sites, got access. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to hand off that access to another team that can use it for effects operations. So we don't want to scare people. It's not power is going to go down, people are going to get hurt, but it's a conversation of an adversary had access. We don't know that they're kicked out of these environments because most people don't have the visibility, as Ben will talk about. And access operations can switch to effects operations pretty quickly. So the lessons learned of what the adversary was doing and why they were doing it in the enterprise doesn't necessarily translate to what they're doing and why they're doing it in the industrial environments. We just need to be aware of that. Next slide. All right, Ben, I think this goes over to you to walk us through some lessons learned here.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Rob. So SolarWinds, I believe, hit the news cycle around December 20th. Beginning the last week of December and feeding pretty much the month of January, our team was quite busy with numerous customers, and this is kind of an amalgamation of everything that we saw over that time period. And the consistency across all of our customers really dovetailed into these three questions. Did my OT or ICS environment have SolarWinds? So largely our customers did not have a solid inventory of not just what hosts are in their environments, but what software versions they had in their environment. And they, in some cases, may have had current or semi-current copies, but they didn't have historical references of the versioning over the course of, in particular, 2020. And then in addition to that, did the question of did my corporate install that I already knew about is being successfully managed within my corporate environment, but did it actually have access into my industrial environments in any particular way? Did it bypass the DMZ and did it was it able to query some of the industrial environments such as that first screenshot that Rob showed that was properly architected? But still is essentially moving from a untrusted, the industrial space is fun in that corporate is considered untrusted, whereas the industrial environments are of a higher trust. So that would be a challenge from any corporate installs of just ruling out if they do have access to some of the control elements or further systems within the industrial. But additionally, the hardest question is that last one. Identify when they do identify a SolarWinds install and a compromised version of the SolarWinds install, do they have confidence on if that host showed signs of post-exploitation activity? By and far, there was not a single customer that we worked with that did have confidence in being able to answer that question, which ultimately is where my team came in to offer some assistance.
Yeah, and on that point, I do want to stress as well, by the time that you're working with firms like ours, we find that there's a bias in the data set where they tend to be pretty mature already because they know they have problems, they want to bring in people, they want to work with people. And so we usually see the folks we work with already at a higher level of maturity than we would expect across the industry. And when they're struggling and they're not able to do this, anecdotally, we sort of extract that out to what the wider industry problems are. And I think there are some things that we need to tackle as a community.
That's a great point, because everyone that we did work with was higher on that maturity scale, and they were able to, once asked and tasked with various collection, they were able to do that collection. A lot of our customers would be extremely challenged to do that. I'll walk through what some of that looks like. Some of the key takeaways, if you haven't been exposed to digital forensics inside of OT or ICS, and just the additional flavor or perspective that the forensics teams truly need to understand, is that the teams themselves are not presented with the right knowledge of to walk in these environments, and there's a challenge of just visibility that I spoke to earlier, as far as not just knowing what versions, also what hosts and networks. Essentially, it's really hard to defend or do forensics in an environment that you have no prior knowledge of, which gets to donuts and exercises. So the biggest takeaway for your digital forensics team as they're approaching something into an ICS environment, if this is their first time walking into that facility, they're already behind the gun, they're already behind the curve, and they truly need to have already started that relationship with the local team before the investigation started. So that means getting out of your cubicle, buying some donuts, buying some coffee, going to the facility and meeting the individuals on those teams, asking questions as far as how does this facility operate? What does a really bad day look like within your facility? And piece together that story and work towards measures of what data might be in their environment that they can collect and pre-stage and have visibility into ahead of an IR case. If you've not done digital forensics either, it should go without saying, but I wouldn't YOLO this. If you don't have training within forensics, if you haven't been exposed to forensics, grabbing the latest version of Security Onion and just rolling with the punches is going to put you even further behind the curve. Not only do you not have visibility into what's going on within the facility and understanding that, but you're also making rash assumptions on how you can pull into this forensics data and do that analysis.
And not to like gatekeep, but if you're an incident response firm and you don't have experience responding in ICS and OT networks, please be transparent with the client. And for the clients out there, be careful in that. We're responding to one right now where a firm that came in before has made the matter worse just because they don't have any experience in OT and kind of ICS environment. So you can do more damage as the defenders than the adversary if you're not careful.
So the first case study, and these are very high level, intentionally so, but the first case that we worked on was really across the fleet. So props to the asset owner. They were able to identify with certainty that they did have SolarWinds in their environment. They looked to us to do a sweep across multiple facilities, approximately a dozen or so facilities, to look for post-exploitation activity. Their challenge was that they did not have a visibility into east-west traffic within their environment, so they may have some perimeter visibility from their ICS environment and their corporate, but they did not have centralized logging on their host data, and they did not see network traffic that would have been easy indicator as far as lateral movement or post-exploitation activity. Because of that, we were relying on host-based collection of doing reviews of what occurred on that host over the previous months, and really only largely answering the question, what happened in the last 30 days, because we lose visibility after that since we're relying on the host-based data. And really what was in scope for this was a collection of domain controllers, as well as the SolarWinds application servers at each location. We were able to collect all memory dumps and some other artifacts from the hosts and do a analysis over the course over those hosts over the course of a 25-day period to give them some assurances that in the November December timeframe we didn't see post exploitation, but that's as far as we could really rule it out because of the lack of network visibility and centralized logging capability. So when you're doing host-based, when you're doing assessments across one or more facility, it gets tricky. You do have to account for some of the idiosyncrasies of industrial environments. So often there are backup networks, there are failover networks, there are test networks. In many of the instances, SolarWinds did have either duplicate hosts for these backup and test networks, or they had access into these backup and test networks. So you have to adequately sweep for that. Rob mentioned the maintenance and diagnostics networks. There's also systems integrators and other third parties that may have tie-ins into the environments. They may be using a SolarWinds on your behalf, or have white labeled, as Rob said, some of their capabilities from that regard. So it's asking those questions, but it's also trust but verify, gaining visibility into these networks and see what activity is occurring from the third-party network into your network is really critical. These are partners of the facility, so it's not that they necessarily are doing anything wrong. They are trusted, but it's a trust and verify sort of situation with any third-party network. And that means your own corporate environment as well. I mentioned the corporate environment is unique and that's considered less trusted than your industrial environments, and it should be considered that way. So services that you may be delivering from corporate into your ICS environment, whether it's SolarWinds or otherwise, are an area of opportunity to really focus in on and understand what controls you have in place, and if you can actually move those services outside of corporate and into a higher trusted zone in that regard. Moving on to the second example, facility one. So this wasn't across the fleet, but this was at one particular facility. The facility actually believed they did not have SolarWinds in their environment in the last days of 2020. However, after they came to that agreement, that assessment, they later identified in January that 3 different beacons came from one facility that were attributed to SolarWinds. And that kicked off an investigation on what's within this facility, is SolarWinds indeed there, and what sort of activity occurred over that time frame. This relied on DNS activity to isolate which hosts were communicating, which hosts essentially had SolarWinds installed on them. And then again, doing data collection primarily on host data, because we still had no east-west traffic or centralized logging in that environment. We were relying on DNS queries, but we didn't have DNS responses in order to build that case. So we still had missing pieces of the puzzle and had to make some assumptions. However, we did identify the last beacon attempt, which was in early December, did correlate to the kill switch being activated within the compromised SolarWinds, which basically put it into an inert state. The time frame lined up against that. Now, the big takeaway here is that certainly the SolarWinds was within this industrial environment, but it had access to the internet to communicate with the adversary. So best practices would be certainly having a firewall in place, which they did. However, their egress filtering, so their filtering of the traffic moving out of their industrial environment and to the corporate, as well as then from corporate to the internet, was completely unblocked. So it allowed for this compromised install to successfully talk with the adversary.
And just to note on that, they were one of very few people that had the DNS logs to be able to say, here's the kill switch. And this is a big lesson learned of all these cases. if you had the east-west traffic analysis, if you had the network visibility Joe Sloak was talking about before, and we've been advocating to the industry, it was a quick indicator check of yes or no, am I compromised? Did I see the right DNS queries? Cool, I'm done. And you could respond very quickly in minutes or hours. If you didn't have that and you had the compromised version, it moves that response into days and weeks to even figure out if you're halfway okay. And because of these kind of adversaries that really dig in and burrow in and are more sophisticated, it really takes then months into the years of making sure that we're really okay across the facility. And so a lot of discussions are around how do we become more resilient as an organization, but without that detection and response capability, moving it into minutes and hours to days, we give the adversary way too much credit and accessibility. Over the next couple of minutes, we're just going to fly through very quickly on kind of how we got here. As Ben and I just chat along, so we go to the next slide, and I'll kind of end this out. Facility 2, same kind of concept. On that one, it was mostly host-based, and there's a trend here of a lot of host-based analysis in industrial environments because they don't have anything else, and so that's where the forensics goes. That is much more time intensive. It's less visibility for the systems of systems environment, and it just makes it for a very long process. Let's go ahead and skip along those since we've got about 3 minutes left. Next slide. NERC-CIP considerations. We put this one, and this will actually go back one, sorry. On the NERC-CIP considerations, it'll just be a slide for you to be able to read into. I know that NERC-CIP doesn't apply to most of you. It did in a number of our cases. So this is just available not for us to brief all the intricacies of NERC-CIP, but to be here for you after the presentation if you kind of want to go through those views. Next. All right, and on these, I'm intentionally going to go very, very quickly. Next slide. Across all of the standards and frameworks and regulations out there, there's a heavy bias towards prevention. And so when we ask, why are we here? Why is it so hard to respond? Why is it so hard to figure out the state of the union? It's not because your asset owners and operators are incompetent. It's actually because they're listening. And all the standards, frameworks, and regulations really put an overemphasis on prevention, not so much on anything active like detect, respond, and recover. So think about that for a second. All the prevention is just like protecting your assets. Active is made up of a bunch of different things you should do, like detect, respond, and recover, and it's still far underemphasized. So we wanted to just show the actual data of how badly that is. Yeah, next slide. So in 62443, major standard, 75% of every piece of guidance and control, preventative, only 25% active. Next. When you look at it from the service provider's perspective, it's even worse, 85% preventative, 25% reactive or active. Next. When you look at it from the risk assessment portion of it, it's 100% preventative. So everything they're doing from security risk assessment for system design, all preventative. Next. When you look at it from when you look at it from a system and technical perspective, 85 versus 15% split. So what's actually going into the requirements of these systems? Next. When you look at it from an SDL perspective, it's actually a little bit better, 50-50. So actually, as we're trying to develop more secure products, and what does that process look like, it captures a nice balance, even though I would say in this case, the preventative is very prescriptive, and the responsive and the active is very high level, like you should monitor. Next. On the component technical details in terms of components and products and the components that go into it, 85-15. Next. And we look at NIST 800 series and similar, 95-2, and then NIST cybersecurity framework, 60-40. And then if you can skip to the very last slide there, Ben. It's okay, Liz, you ran over on the last talk with Joe. I'm not making apologies yet. So from closing, no, it's fine. It's fine, Liz. We hang out at one concert together and all of a sudden, no, that was the one I wanted, actually, the closing thoughts. Yep, sorry. So a lot of the policy discussions I see end up being, how do we prevent the next SolarWinds? And I will tell you, as a community, we put so much focus there already, and every standard, regulation, framework, et cetera, is already so heavily focused on that, that yes, you of course should do that, and please go look at that, but that's not the problem. The problem is we're not resilient. Once prevention fails, and it will in a supply chain attack, we are very much under-resourced in visibility, detection, response. And without those things, you will not be resilient in these kind of scenarios. And every conversation policy-wise I see is, how do you prevent the next SolarWinds? I don't want to prevent the next SolarWinds. I want to take a process that's weeks, months, and years and move it into minutes, days, and hours. That's what will make our community a lot better. And that's the problem we have on the OT side. So with that, that's our presentation. Thanks so much for tuning in. And Liz, over to you.
Well, thank you. And one of the things that I really thought and would love to kind of drive home for those listening, paying attention, watching the recaps is one, the comment to engage with your customers and the community and building that resiliency, that having those relationships, because it's a great tie-in to where Sharon's coming in next, and he's gonna highlight, his work in the community as well as his research, but having those resources of when you see something going on. So thanks, Rob. Thanks, Ben. I highly recommend folks check out their work in a slew of other places as well. And again, shout out to Ben for embracing the theme